Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive, where we really try to cut through the noise on these critical global issues that are, well, everywhere.
Great to be here.
Today, we're plunging into something pretty high stakes.
Yes.
A confrontation that's definitely making waves across continents.
Yeah, this is big.
We're talking about the escalating trade dispute between India and the United States, two massive global players.
And it's much more than just tariffs, isn't it?
Exactly. It's not just about the trade numbers. It feels like a real test of geopolitical wills, a fascinating look at strategic autonomy.
And it's fundamentally reshaping global alliances as we speak. It really is.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to try and pull together all this complex information. We've looked at geopolitical briefings, economic analyses, diplomatic reports, all current as of early August 2025.
Right.
And the goal is to give you a really clear picture of what's actually happening, why it matters so much, and maybe what comes next for the world order.
And getting that clarity, that sort of granular understanding, it's just so critical right now, more than ever, really. This deep dive is, I think, absolutely essential if you're trying to truly grasp these shifting sands of global power.
Yeah.
We're not just going to unpack what happened in this tariff war, although we'll cover that. We're going deep into the profound implications for trade, yes, but also for that intricate dance of diplomacy. And importantly, for this whole idea of a multipolar world that's, well, it's rapidly taking shape right in front of us.
All right, let's unpack this then. This whole confrontation, it didn't just explode overnight. It's clearly been simmering for a while.
That's right.
Our sources make it pretty clear this wasn't some sudden isolated thing. It was really a culmination of actions building up, wasn't it?
Yeah.
A kind of pressure cooker that finally blew.
Yeah, a crescendo is a good way to put it.
So what exactly triggered this recent flare-up? What was the immediate spark?
That's the key question, isn't it? And it's important to see it as a deliberate turning point. What had been sort of long-standing trade friction, it really escalated into an open confrontation.
How so?
Well, due to a series of pretty aggressive actions from the Trump administration, it really marked a shift from, let's say, negotiation towards direct economic coercion.
And the immediate shockwave, the thing that really grabbed headlines globally, that was President Trump's announcement on August 1st, 2025, wasn't it?
Yes. The imposition of that substantial 25% blanket import tariff on all Indian exports to the U.S.
Right. All of them.
Yeah.
Not a small adjustment. This was a huge, sweeping move. And our sources indicate this fulfilled a threat that was made very explicitly after earlier talks stalled out.
Exactly. It signaled a real breakdown in diplomatic efforts.
So that 25% number,
Yeah.
it wasn't just culled out of thin air.
No, it was a very significant, economically impactful escalation. And that 25% duty, it's not just high in itself, it's notably higher than the tariffs the U.S. has set for other major economies, other trade partners.
Right. So it singles India out.
It does. This disproportionate rate makes Indian goods significantly less competitive. Think about comparing them to goods from, say, Vietnam or Indonesia. Their exports often face much lower, sometimes even zero, U.S. tariffs.
And the scale of this, what kind of money are we talking about?
Well, estimates vary, but this single action potentially affects somewhere between $40 billion and maybe up to $87 billion worth of Indian goods coming into the U.S. every year.
Wow, that's huge.
It is. And some initial estimates coming from India's financial sector suggest it could shave about 0.5%, 0.5%, off India's GDP growth in the coming fiscal year. And that's growth that's usually quite robust.
So understandably, the Indian government felt.
They felt distinctly singled out, as they put it. Yeah, singled out for harsher treatment.
Okay, so August 1st wasn't an arbitrary date. It was the end point of a clear timeline, a buildup of escalation, maybe some missed signals along the way. Let's trace that origin story. Where did the standoff really begin?
Right. It really kicked off in earnest on April 2nd, 2025. That's when President Trump announced his Liberation Day initiative, as he called it.
Liberation Day.
Yeah.
Okay. What did that involve?
It established a new baseline tariff, 10% on most imports into the U.S. But, and this is crucial, it came with a very clear, very potent threat.
Which was?
A second wave of higher country-specific reciprocal tariffs, potentially ranging up to 26%, maybe even 27%.
On who?
On nations that the administration decided were engaging in unfair trade practices. And right from the start, in those initial statements, India was explicitly named, included on that list of targeted nations.
Okay, so India was on notice from April. But then on April 9th, There was a pause, right?
Right.
A tactical pause.
That's right. Trump announced a 90-day suspension of those higher tariffs. Essentially, it opened a negotiation window, a 3-month period to try and hash out what they were calling a mini deal with various countries.
So a temporary de-escalation, but the clock was ticking very loudly.
Exactly. And intense, high-stakes negotiations follow through that window, April, May, June. But, as the initial July 7th deadline got closer, it became really clear that significant gaps remained, especially between the U.S. and India.
On what specific issues?
Particularly on market access for U.S. agricultural products and also medical devices. Despite getting an extension later to August 1st, the talks just couldn't bridge those core divides.
So July 7th comes and goes, talks are stalled, and Trump issues an ultimatum.
Pretty much. Signaled that the August 1st tariffs would indeed happen. Then, July 31st, the formal announcement, 25% on India plus this unspecified penalty, which kicked in on August 7th.
Okay, but here's the really striking part, something that might surprise people. Our sources say both sides actually came incredibly close to a deal in July. Is that right?
It is. It's one of the most baffling parts of this whole saga. India, in what sounds like a significant diplomatic move, had apparently agreed to substantial U.S. demands. Things like 0 tariffs on 40% of U.S. industrial exports, gradual cuts on American cars and alcohol imports, big concessions.
So New Delhi thought they were almost there.
They seemingly did. They believed the remaining gaps, even on sensitive areas like agriculture, could probably have been bridged with just a bit more dialogue.
So what happened? Why did the U.S. walk away from what sounds like a nearly done deal, a pivotal deal, really?
This is where it gets really interesting, and frankly, where the strategic miscalculation seems just glaring. Washington, surprisingly, seems to have fumbled a winning hand.
How so?
Okay, so here's the insight from our sources. Despite India offering these major concessions that, in any normal negotiation would be seen as a huge breakthrough.
0 tariffs on 40% of industrial goods, cuts on autos, alcohol.
Right. Despite all that, Trump simply walked away. It seems he wasn't playing the long game with India. He was chasing immediate headline-grabbing wins elsewhere.
With Japan and South Korea, apparently.
Yeah, exactly. He likely saw quick bilateral deals with them as easier political victories, something he could announce quickly. And in doing so, he left New Delhi completely stunned as that tariff deadline hit.
So it was optics over strategy.
It looks like a textbook case of prioritizing immediate perceived political wins over a deep, complex strategic alignment with a rising global power like India, and it directly sabotaged what could have been a really pivotal agreement.
And then there's this other element you mentioned, this vague, unspecified penalty. That wasn't just about tariffs, was it?
No, precisely. Beyond the concrete 25% tariffs on goods, Trump added this ominous, vague threat, an unspecified penalty.
And the interpretation was?
It was widely and pretty much immediately interpreted by analysts, by officials, as the possibility of secondary sanctions.
Aimed at what?
Aimed at punishing India for its continued, very robust purchases of Russian oil and weapons, essentially extending the economic pressure beyond just direct trade.
That sounds less like a standard trade tactic and more like, I don't know, psychological warfare.
It absolutely has elements of that. This deliberate vagueness, it's a classic strategy and quite effective.
Why vague? What's the advantage?
By keeping the penalty undefined, the administration created maximum uncertainty. Think about it from the perspective of Indian businesses, banks, officials. It makes it nearly impossible for them to accurately calculate the full risk, financial, reputational, of continuing to engage with Russia.
So it hinders their planning.
Completely. It hinders any precise, cost-based assessment or response. The ultimate goal here seems to be inducing a powerful chilling effect, getting Indian companies, maybe major oil refiners, defense contractors to self-sanction, to scale back their dealings with Moscow preemptively.
So the U.S. gets its goal without actually imposing formal sanctions.
Exactly. It lets the U.S. achieve its objective, reducing India-Russia ties, without having to formally implement and then diplomatically defend concrete secondary sanctions that would almost certainly be challenged at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, the body that sets global trade rules.
So it's a lower-cost way to apply pressure.
A low-cost, high-impact method of exerting coercive pressure. It forces India to react to this kind of nebulous threat rather than a transparent, quantifiable policy.
Okay, so piecing this all together, what was Washington's core rationale? Why such aggressive moves against India, a country they often call a critical strategic partner, especially in the Indo-Pacific? Was it really just a trade deficit, or was something deeper going on?
Well, Washington put forward a kind of multi-pronged justification. It expertly blended, the public rhetoric with what seemed to be very clear geopolitical objectives underneath.
Okay, so prong one, the public narrative.
Right. Prong one, the public story, heavily pushed by President Trump himself, repeatedly focused on fixing perceived trade injustices. He famously called India the Tariff King.
A label that probably didn't go down well in New Delhi.
I imagine not, given their own history with protectionism. Trump accused India of having far too high tariffs and creating these strenuous and obnoxious non-monetary trade barriers that supposedly blocked American goods.
And the trade deficit number was key here.
Yes, the administration consistently pointed to the U.S. trade deficit with India. It was $45.8 billion in goods in 2024 as a key trigger, as evidence of these imbalances needing correction.
Okay, that's the stated public reason. But our sources strongly suggest there was a more significant underlying motivation, something beyond just the trade numbers.
Exactly. Which brings us to prong two, and this is where that deeper strategic calculation really comes in. The tariffs were explicitly used as a geopolitical lever.
How so?
Well, the timing, the rhetoric that went with it, and especially that unspecified penalty, it all made it undeniably clear that a core motivation was to punish India for its strategic autonomy.
Specifically regarding Russia.
Specifically regarding its robust and actually deepening defense and energy relationship with Russia. Even with the ongoing war in Ukraine, Trump directly linked the tariffs to India being Russia's largest buyer of energy, along with China, and to its continued buying of Russian military gear. He framed these actions as basically enabling Moscow's war effort.
So the strategy was twofold. Open markets and pressure India on Russia.
Precisely. Force open Indian markets, yes, but also dissuade India from deepening its strategic ties with Russia. It was a clear attempt to pull India more squarely into line with the Western sanctions regime against Moscow.
Okay, and was there a third prong to Washington's strategy?
Yes. The tariffs also served as a pretty blunt, coercive tool to force concessions in those stalled bilateral trade talks we mentioned.
The ones that almost succeeded.
Right. For months, U.S. negotiators had been pushing really hard for more market access into India's highly protected agricultural and dairy sectors, and also for removing price caps on things like medical devices.
Demands India had resisted.
Consistently resisted, citing domestic sensitivities.
Yeah.
So imposing the tariffs right after those talks failed shows they were being used as a tool to break the deadlock, to force concessions on terms favorable to Washington, basically saying, if you won't deal our way, we'll make you.
Wow, okay. Given that level of aggression, India's response, it's been called a masterclass in strategic statecraft by some analysts. Let's look at their approach to this kind of good cop, bad cop strategy. It seems remarkably nuanced.
It certainly has been. India's reaction wasn't just simple tit-for-tat retaliation. It was really multifaceted, very sophisticated. They used different parts of the government to send distinct but ultimately complementary messages.
What was the goal of that dual-track approach?
It allowed New Delhi to look both pragmatic and reasonable internationally, keeping the door open for a future deal, while also appearing resolute and principled to its own people and to other global powers, firmly defending its sovereign rights.
Okay, let's start with the good cop. Who played that role and what was the message?
The initial response, the good cop, if you will, was largely led by India's Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Their messaging was notably measured, focused on de-escalation, really designed to keep communication channels open.
What do they say specifically?
They put out statements confirming they were studying its implications. They stressed that India was still committed to negotiating a fair, balanced, and mutually beneficial trade deal with the U.S.
So reassuring signals.
Exactly. Reassuring domestic stakeholders like Indian exporters and also the U.S. trade establishment, signaling that India was still a rational actor open to a deal. But at the same time, they also vowed to take all steps necessary to secure our national interests. So keeping the lines open, but with a firm undertone.
Okay, so that's the Commerce Ministry. Then we saw the bad cop. Or maybe, as you said, the principled cop step in with a much sharper tone.
Right. In sharp contrast, India's Ministry of External Affairs, the MEA, delivered a really forceful and principled rebuttal, directly confronting the geopolitical justification the U.S. was using for the tariffs.
How did they do that?
In a very strongly worded 6-point statement, the MEA basically blasted the U.S. move, called it unjustified and unreasonable, not just economically, but morally and strategically. It was a very clear signal that India wouldn't be bullied.
And this is where they really turned the tables, wasn't it? Calling out hypocrisy. It felt like a powerful counter-narrative.
Absolutely. The MEA just systematically dismantled the American argument. They highlighted what they explicitly called the double standards of Western nations, especially regarding trade with Russia.
What examples did they use?
They pointed out, with real diplomatic precision, that Europe's trade with Russia, even during the Ukraine conflict, was significantly larger than India's in absolute terms. And they even noted, quite pointedly, that the U.S. itself still imports critical Russian materials, things like fertilizers, chemicals, even nuclear fuel, really underscoring the selective application of pressure. It was a powerful public counter-argument designed to undercut any moral high ground the U.S. was trying to claim.
And then came that moment that really stood out, that aha moment for many observers, when India reminded Washington about its own previous stance on Russian oil.
Indeed, that was a masterstroke. The MEA pointedly reminded Washington that it had actively encouraged India's Russian oil imports just last year. To help stabilize global energy markets right after the Ukraine conflict started, oil prices were soaring, Western nations were scrambling to find alternatives. The MEA stated, very directly, something like, "It is revealing that the very nations criticizing India are themselves indulging in trade with Russia. Unlike our case, such trade is not even a vital compulsion."
Wow, that's direct.
It was a powerful, fact-based reminder. It really put the U.S. administration on the back foot, exposing a clear contradiction in their policy messaging. It made India's continued purchases look less like defiance and more like a pragmatic necessity that the West itself had previously encouraged.
So this whole good cop, bad cop strategy, this mix of careful diplomacy and sharp defiance, it seems to have a clear purpose beyond just managing the immediate crisis.
Yeah.
What does it tell us about India's broader strategy here, and maybe its place in the new global order?
It's a highly calculated posture, absolutely. It allows India to be pragmatic on trade specifics while staying fiercely assertive on sovereignty and its independent foreign policy. It sends this really unequivocal message. Look, the terms of trade might be up for negotiation, but India's fundamental right to pursue its own foreign policy based on its national interests, not external pressure, that's not negotiable.
And it helps them control the narrative, too.
Yes, definitely. This approach lets them proactively manage the story. Like when they quickly debunked those fake reports about planning retaliatory tariffs, it shows a sophisticated effort to handle escalation through established diplomatic channels, not letting misinformation or knee-jerk reactions drive their response. Ultimately, it emphasizes stability and control, even under intense pressure. It's really a hallmark of their growing strategic autonomy in action.
It seems India isn't just reacting defensively. They appear to be using this moment almost strategically to strengthen their long-term position. Like these tariffs are an unintended boost for their existing domestic plans. What are their absolute red lines, the things they just won't compromise on no matter the economic heat?
This is such a critical part of understanding India's stance. Their refusal to buckle isn't just stubbornness, it's part of a conscious, long-term strategy to redefine their role globally. And it's deeply rooted in domestic realities. At the heart of it are these non-negotiable red lines. They're seen as fundamental to the nation's stability, its social fabric, its economic well-being, not just bargaining chips.
And the biggest, most prominent red line has always been agriculture.
Right.
That agricultural firewall, as it's sometimes called.
Absolutely. It's probably the firmest one. For decades, India has refused to open its agriculture and dairy sectors to totally free international competition. And they're making no exception for the U.S. now.
Why is that so non-negotiable?
It comes down to several critical, really sensitive factors. Sociopolitically, you're talking about the livelihoods of literally hundreds of millions of small, marginal farmers. Many are subsistence farmers on tiny plots. Exposing them to competition from America's highly subsidized, industrialized farm sector with its massive economies of scale risks huge economic disruption, widespread rural poverty, and potentially serious social unrest. It's a massive domestic political issue.
And it's not just economics, is it? There are cultural and religious dimensions, too, especially with dairy.
That's entirely correct. There's strong, widespread opposition to U.S. dairy products. A big part of it is concern about non-vegetarian additives used in U.S. cattle feed. That's deeply unacceptable to a large segment of India's predominantly Hindu and vegetarian population.
And GMOs.
Yes. Furthermore, the Indian government has held a very firm line against allowing genetically modified, or GM, foods in cattle feed. That reflects significant public skepticism about GM products, plus a strong desire to protect India's biodiversity and traditional farming practices. These aren't just trade barriers in the technical sense, they're deeply felt cultural and ethical lines.
Okay, so agriculture and dairy are huge. What other sectors are seeing India draw these firm lines?
Well, beyond agriculture, India has also fiercely defended its sovereignty in other critical areas, like public health and the whole burgeoning digital economy.
Public health, how so?
For instance, U.S. negotiators kept pushing hard for India to remove price caps on essential medical devices, things like coronary stents, knee implants. India put those caps in place specifically to make these life-saving devices more affordable for its huge population. It was a critical public health measure.
And India refused to lift them.
Firmly rejected those demands, unequivocally prioritizing affordable health care for its citizens over the profit margins of American medtech companies.
And the digital space, data localization.
Right. Similarly, India has maintained its push for data localization policies. These legally require companies to store Indian users' data within India's borders. Despite really strong objections and lobbying from U.S. tech giants, India's held its ground. They see data sovereignty as critical for national security, economic independence, and privacy in the digital age. It's a strategic assertion of control over their own digital future. And this firm defense of the red lines, it naturally connects to India's big Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative, self-reliant India. What's truly fascinating here, and maybe a key takeaway for you listening, is how this external pressure, these tariffs, seems to be paradoxically strengthening India's domestic economic agenda. It's like an unintended catalyst.
Yeah, so the very tool meant to pry open India's economy is somehow making it embrace self-reliance even tighter. That is remarkable, counterintuitive almost. Makes you wonder if Washington really saw that coming.
Precisely. The U.S. tariff offensive, aimed specifically at forcing India open, is having this powerful, paradoxical effect. It's reinforcing and actually accelerating the Indian government's nationalist economic agenda.
How does it work politically?
Well, the external pressure from these tariffs becomes this incredibly potent catalyst for initiatives like Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India. It transforms them from just policy slogans into urgent strategic imperatives that now have broad public backing.
So the threat becomes an opportunity.
Exactly. The Indian government can now frame its Swadeshi, or local first, push not just as an ideological choice, but as a pragmatic, necessary, even patriotic response to unjustified foreign coercion. This narrative helps rally domestic support, effectively turning the U.S. into an external antagonist who inadvertently validates India's push for greater self-sufficiency. In a way, the tariffs have become an unintended subsidy for Indian economic nationalism.
Okay, so beyond the rhetoric, what practical steps are they taking to actually push this self-reliant agenda while under tariff pressure?
The government's response has been pretty swift and multi-pronged. Prime Minister Modi has taken a very public, very defiant stance, consistently urging Indians to buy local, support domestic industries.
And beyond urging.
Well, the Commerce Ministry is actively pushing Indian exporters to build and promote homegrown brands. The idea is to reduce their historical dependence on government subsidies, make them inherently more resilient to shocks like tariffs. And at the same time, New Delhi is rolling out concrete measures to mitigate the immediate economic pain for its export industries.
And what is the expected economic impact on India? And what specific mitigation efforts are they putting in place to soften that blow?
Well, our sources indicate that while India's overall economy is quite resilient, the tariffs are projected to have a severe short-term impact, especially on certain sectors.
Which ones?
ICRA, a respected Indian rating agency, has already downgraded the country's GDP growth forecast for FY26, dropped it from 6.2% down to 6.0%, explicitly citing these U.S. tariff risks as a primary reason.
In the most vulnerable sectors.
Expected to be the highly labor-intensive industries, the ones employing vast numbers of people. Think textiles and garments, auto parts, agrochemicals, cut and polished diamonds. These tariffs put key Indian industries at a serious competitive disadvantage. Suddenly, their products are 25% more expensive in the crucial U.S. market compared to rivals, say, from Vietnam or Bangladesh for textiles, or Mexico for auto parts, who face lower or zero tariffs.
So U.S. buyers might just switch suppliers.
Exactly. There's a strong incentive for them to switch. That directly impacts Indian jobs, corporate margins. In response, the Commerce Ministry is prepping a pretty significant relief package around 20,000 crore, which is about $2.4 billion specifically to support exporters.
What's in the package?
Crucial measures like extending fiscal incentives, things like the rallied scheme, which refunds embedded taxes and duties to make goods more competitive globally. They're also providing interest subsidies and speeding up GST refunds, which is vital for cash flow, for liquidity for these businesses.
So it sounds like India isn't just hunkering down trying to absorb the hit. They're actively diversifying their global footprint, seeking entirely new paths, almost using this as a catalyst for deeper strategic change.
That's absolutely a key part of their evolving long-term strategy. And it's something many other nations are watching very closely. This dispute with the U.S. has really starkly shown the risks of relying too heavily on any single market, no matter how big or important it is.
Right.
So consequently, a core pillar of India's long-term economic strategy is this aggressive diversification of trade relationships, of export markets. And it's not just reactive. It's a conscious, proactive effort to de-risk its global economic engagement and strengthen its position in what's clearly a rapidly fragmenting world order.
So beyond the U.S., where are they looking? Who are they trying to build these new trade avenues and deeper partnerships with?
India is actively pursuing new trade deals and deepening existing ties with partners that offer real alternatives to the U.S. market. For instance, they've significantly pushed forward trade talks with the European Union, a massive, wealthy market, and they've successfully finalized a comprehensive trade deal with the U.K. post-Brexit.
And encouraging exporters to look elsewhere.
Critically, yes. Indian exporters are being explicitly encouraged and supported to pivot towards other large and growing markets. Latin America, Africa, and particularly Southeast Asia, the ASEAN bloc. The goal is to cushion the blow from the U.S. tariffs by building a more resilient, globally dispersed trade network, not just finding new customers temporarily.
And this diversification isn't just about finding new buyers, is it? It sounds like it's tied into a much deeper strategy around global value chains.
Exactly right. It's more than just selling existing products elsewhere. It's a strategic, long-term effort to embed India more deeply, more inextricably into emerging global value chains, especially as multinational corporations are actively pursuing these China plus one strategies.
Explain China plus one quickly.
Right. It means companies are looking to diversify their manufacturing away from an over-reliance on China. They want to add another robust production base, often looking at countries like India to bolster their supply chain resilience, mitigate geopolitical risks.
So India wants to be that right plus one.
By positioning itself as stable, reliable, increasingly competitive as a manufacturing hub, India aims to attract that significant foreign direct investment, the technology transfers it needs to become an indispensable node in the global economy. Moving up the value chain. This fits perfectly with its participation in things like the Quad Critical Minerals Initiative, aiming to build resilient supply chains for strategic materials outside of Chinese control.
And what about energy? Especially since Russian oil was a trigger for the tariffs. Are they backing down or doubling down or looking elsewhere?
Well, India's continued reliance on cheap Russian oil remains a central point of friction with the West, absolutely. But New Delhi views it primarily as an economic necessity. Russian oil now makes up roughly 35–40% of India's crude imports. That's a huge jump from just 3% back in early 2021.
And their justification?
Indian leaders consistently argued that this rapid shift towards Russia was basically compelled by Western sanctions diverting other traditional suppliers, and that cutting off Russian oil now would cause devastating price spikes and severe economic harm to India's massive developing economy.
So instead of yielding
to pressure, New Delhi is actively negotiating deeper discounts with Moscow. They're establishing rupee-based payment mechanisms to further insulate themselves from potential U.S. financial sanctions. But at the same time, India is also intensifying its courtship of Gulf states for long-term energy partnerships, always hedging, keeping diverse options open.
And we're seeing this play out in broader groups like BRICS too, right? With initiatives that could genuinely reshape global finance. It feels like India is hedging against the dollar system itself.
You're absolutely spot on. India's active and increasingly enthusiastic participation in BRICS discussions, things like a cross-border digital payment system, and notably exploring a common reserve currency. That's a direct strategic response to the U.S. weaponizing the dollar.
An idea that gained urgency.
Definitely. This project, which maybe once seemed like a distant dream, gained significant urgent momentum as the Trump administration used the dollar-centric trade system as a weapon. India, which used to tread carefully on these ideas to avoid annoying Washington, is now actively participating. It's a clear, pragmatic hedge against U.S. trade volatility and financial coercion. Domestically, Modi's government is also accelerating its Make in India campaign, trying to strategically substitute imports with local production. It's partly economic, creating jobs for a huge workforce, and partly geopolitical, avoiding overexposure to any single foreign market or currency system. And if we just connect all these threads, step back for the bigger picture. What's truly significant, I think, is that India is intentionally building something potentially more valuable than just immediate trade relief. It's building geopolitical credibility. It's demonstrating genuine strategic autonomy in action.
That's a really profound thought. How does absorbing economic pain rather than just giving in actually translate into geopolitical strength, into credibility on the world stage?
Well, by taking the economic hit from the tariffs, but resolutely refusing to compromise on its core national interests, India is making a powerful, unambiguous statement globally. This whole standoff has become this high-stakes, real-world litmus test for its long-held doctrine of strategic autonomy.
Explain that term again briefly.
Strategic autonomy, basically, the ability to pursue your national interests without being coerced or dictated to by major powers. For years, this was a cornerstone of Indian foreign policy rhetoric. The U.S. tariffs, explicitly designed to force changes in India's economic policies and its foreign policy alignment, effectively pushed this doctrine from theory into difficult, concrete public practice.
So this is more than just resisting pressure, it's sending a deliberate signal to everyone.
Precisely. By not folding under U.S. pressure, India demonstrates that its strategic autonomy isn't just talk. It's a core, non-negotiable principle of its statecraft, not some conditional posture you can buy off or abandon when things get tough. This sends an unambiguous signal to all the other major players, China, Russia, the EU, about the seriousness of India's ambition to be an independent global pole in this emerging multipolar world.
And that builds credibility.
It builds a unique and invaluable kind of geopolitical capital credibility. It enhances India's reputation as a reliable, truly sovereign power. That makes it a more attractive and, crucially, a more respected partner for a whole range of nations trying to navigate this complex, fragmenting global order. In the long run, this currency of credibility might prove far more valuable, far more enduring than the export revenues lost in the short term. It really solidifies India's shift from being a historical rule taker to becoming a burgeoning rule maker in the international system.
Now, this U.S. pressure seems to be having another major, maybe unintended consequence, pushing India closer to America's main rivals. Are we actually seeing the emergence of a unified Russia, India, China, a RIC bloc, as a serious counterweight to Western influence?
That's a very natural question to ask, and certainly there are strong signals coming from one of those partners suggesting exactly that kind of alignment. The Kremlin, in particular, has emerged as the most vocal, the most persistent champion of reviving and strengthening that RIC trilateral format.
Why is Russia so keen on RIC?
Well, for Moscow, which is heavily sanctioned by the West and increasingly reliant on its strategic partnership with Beijing, the RIC framework serves several vital purposes. It's a crucial diplomatic platform to show that Russia isn't globally isolated, that it still holds sway among major world powers. More fundamentally, it's central to Russia's long-term goal of fostering what they call a just and rational multipolar world order, one that actively challenges the U.S.-led system.
And this U.S.-India dispute just plays right into Russia's hands, doesn't it? A perfect opportunity for them.
It absolutely does. This ongoing trade fight gives Moscow a prime, timely opportunity to advance its agenda, to position itself strategically as a reliable, supportive partner to an India that's currently feeling significant Western pressure.
And we're seeing evidence of this in high-level meetings.
Yes, this dynamic is underscored by a whole series of high-level engagements. India's National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, flew to Moscow on August 6th for talks specifically aimed at strengthening Russia-India's strategic ties. Analysts noted that trip gained renewed urgency directly because of Trump's tariff threat over India's Russian oil purchases.
And others followed.
He was quickly followed by other senior Indian officials. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar is due in Moscow later this month, and significantly, President Putin himself is apparently expected to travel to India later this year. That would be his first major visit to a country outside the former Soviet bloc since the Ukraine war began.
So these frequent high-level meetings, they send a very clear message.
They do indeed. Collectively, they send an unmistakable signal that India will not isolate Moscow despite persistent U.S. pressure and threats. In fact, Indian and Russian officials meeting just this week reaffirmed their deep commitment to boost defense cooperation. They specifically noted meeting in a warm and friendly atmosphere, vowing to deepen their privileged strategic partnership. And tellingly, this meeting happened precisely amid President Trump's threats to slap harsh sanctions on India for its ongoing trade with Russia. It's a clear demonstration of India's resolve. However, and this is a really important however, while Russia's clearly eager for this trilateral axis to solidify, the Great Wall of Mistrust between India and China remains this monumental, enduring obstacle. It fundamentally limits the potential of any RIC bloc.
We're talking about the border dispute, of course, the Himalayas.
Precisely. The unresolved and increasingly militarized border dispute in the Himalayas, which, let's not forget, led to deadly clashes in 2020, remains the single most defining, most antagonistic feature of the Sino-Indian relationship. From New Delhi's perspective, China is now unequivocally its primary, most pressing security threat. This perception has fundamentally reshaped India's entire strategic calculus. Defending against Beijing is prioritized above almost everything else.
And India sees China's actions in the region, its growing footprint, as part of a deliberate strategy, encirclement.
That's entirely correct. India views China's growing political, economic, military footprint across South Asia, across the Indian Ocean, alongside its deep all-weather partnership with Pakistan, as part of a deliberate long-term strategy of strategic encirclement. This deep-seated, almost existential mistrust in New Delhi about Beijing's long-term intentions, its territorial ambitions, it fundamentally overrides any potential tactical alignment that might pop up from shared complaints about Washington's trade policies. For India, the threat from China is just too direct, too profound, to be easily swept aside for some convenient anti-U.S. alignment.
Okay, so despite finding some common ground, like on Russian oil or wanting a multipolar world, India is unlikely to just bandwagon with Beijing against Washington. Why not? What's India's core calculation here?
India's response to Russia's consistent RIC overtures has been characteristically cautious, notably non-committal. This reflects its broader, deeply ingrained foreign policy doctrine, strategic autonomy.
So they see some value in RIC, but not as an alliance.
Exactly. New Delhi certainly sees value in the RIC format as a consultative mechanism, a useful diplomatic forum to discuss regional, global issues with two major neighbors, both nuclear powers. But it steadfastly resists any idea of RIC evolving into a formal, binding alliance or some explicitly anti-Western bloc.
So it's a careful balancing act, isn't it? Not choosing sides outright.
It's exactly that. India's strategy is one of multi-alignment, or what you might call balancing rather than bandwagoning with any single bloc. It consistently tries to maintain its independence, maximize its diplomatic and strategic options by engaging constructively with all major power centers.
Which explains why they're in groups like RIC and the Quad simultaneously.
Precisely. That's why India participates in forums like RIC, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, BRICS, often seen as challenging the West, while also being a committed, increasingly active member of the Quad alongside the U.S., Japan, and Australia. The Quad is widely seen as a democratic counterbalance to China in the Indo-Pacific.
So swapping the U.S. for China is unthinkable.
For India, trading a difficult, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately democratic partner like the U.S. for an expansionist, authoritarian adversary like China would be seen as not just ill-advised, but outright strategic folly. This sophisticated, sometimes seemingly contradictory balancing act is the essence of India's 21st century statecraft, which leads to the conclusion that, despite the headlines and Russia's pushing, the RIC is likely to remain largely a geopolitical mirage.
Meaning it might look like a unified front from a distance, but internally it's not really cohesive.
Precisely that. When you put all these deep-seated factors together, especially that India-China mistrust, it strongly suggests RIC won't evolve into a cohesive, truly unified strategic axis. The inherent contradiction between India's fundamental security interests and China's regional and global ambitions is just too great, too embedded to be overcome by shared complaints about the U.S.
So the U.S.-India friction creates an opening, but doesn't change the fundamentals.
It creates a diplomatic opening, primarily for Russia. It lets Moscow reinforce its time-tested partnership with New Delhi and loudly champion its multipolar vision. But it does not fundamentally alter the deeply adversarial nature of the India-China relationship, especially along that disputed border.
So we'll likely see some cooperation, but it will stay limited. Transactional.
That's the most realistic outlook, I think. The three powers will undoubtedly find common ground, coordinate on specific, overlapping interests where their goals happen to align. Things like advocating for multipolarity in global forums, maybe exploring alternatives to the dollar and trade settlements, perhaps even some limited cooperation on regional issues like counterterrorism.
But not a true alliance.
No. The grouping will remain, fundamentally, a geopolitical mirage, often looking more cohesive from a Western viewpoint than it actually is from within. Those fundamental strategic divergences, especially the deep Sino-Indian fault line, will persist. They'll prevent translating shared anti-hegemonic rhetoric into a substantive, unified strategic agenda. Think about India's deep suspicion of Chinese tech banning Huawei, ZTE, that persists even while they share an interest in developing alternatives to Western digital infrastructure. A formal trilateral military or security alliance, something that would truly challenge existing blocs, highly improbable because of these conflicts and the fundamental lack of trust.
Okay, shifting gears a bit, this isn't just about geopolitics and high strategy. There's very real, immediate economic costs. What's the projected impact on India from these sudden tariffs?
Right. For India, the U.S. tariffs definitely represent a significant short-term economic blow, no question. However, as we discussed, it's also, kind of paradoxically, serving as this powerful catalyst for long-term strategic adjustments, economic reorientation. So the impact is multifaceted, hits different sectors differently.
What's the most immediate effect?
The most immediate tangible effect is a severe hit to India's merchandise exports to what is its largest single market. Projections from economic analysts in India suggest a potential decline of nearly 30% in these exports, dropping from around $86.5 billion in FY25 down to maybe $60.6 billion in FY26. That's not just a number, it represents real lost business, potential job losses.
And which sectors are feeling that pinch the most? Where are livelihoods and profits really threatened?
This contraction will be felt most acutely in India's labor-intensive sectors, the ones crucial for employment, often with large informal workforces. Think industries like garments and textiles employing millions, or the gems and jewelry sector, engineering goods. These are highly sensitive to price changes.
And the GDP impact?
The Indian rating agency ICRA, which provides key economic forecasts, has already downgraded the country's GDP growth forecast for FY26 from 6.2% to 6.0%. They explicitly cited the tariff risks as a primary factor. These tariffs put key Indian industries at a severe disadvantage. Imagine a small factory in Tirupur making clothes for U.S. brands. With a 25% tariff, their products suddenly become uncompetitive against rivals from, say, Bangladesh or Vietnam, who face lower or zero U.S. duties.
Creating that strong incentive for U.S. buyers to just switch suppliers.
Exactly, directly impacting the livelihoods of thousands of garment workers, many of them women, in a sector crucial for India's employment.
But India's economy is huge, it's diversified. Does it have some built-in resilience? Something to cushion this blow, prevent a total catastrophe?
Indeed it does. The damage, while significant, painful for specific sectors, isn't projected to be catastrophic for India's overall macroeconomy. India's economic strength is really underpinned by incredibly robust domestic demand. That accounts for roughly 80% of its GDP. That provides a substantial, powerful cushion against external shocks like this.
And service exports help too.
Absolutely. India's strong performance in service exports, things like IT, business process outsourcing, which are not subject to these goods tariffs, continues to be a major foreign exchange earner. And as we talked about, the government's aggressive push for trade diversification with the EU, UK, alongside its Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative, are all helping to buffer the overall impact and build that long-term resilience. But now, what's truly fascinating here, and often gets missed in the headlines, is the boomerang effect. How these tariffs, designed to hurt India, are actually inflicting significant self-harm on the United States itself.
A boomerang effect. That's a powerful image.
Yeah.
How exactly does that self-harm show up for the U.S. economy?
Well, this tariff policy, intended as this precise tool of coercion, is proving to be a textbook example of self-inflicted economic pain. At their core, the tariffs function as a direct tax on American businesses and ultimately on American consumers.
How does that work?
By artificially raising the cost of imported goods from India, they are directly projected to add somewhere between 1.2% and 2.0% to baseline U.S. inflation. That's a significant bump, especially when inflation is already a concern.
And that translates to real costs for people.
It translates to a tangible, unwelcome estimated cost of around $2,400 for the average American household per year, just from higher prices. This erodes real purchasing power, puts a direct strain on family budgets, especially for lower-income households who are more sensitive to price hikes on everyday goods.
And it's not just about general consumer stuff, right? It hits critical supply chains too, especially something vital like pharmaceuticals.
You're absolutely right. This policy glaringly exposes critical dependencies in the U.S. supply chain, particularly in public health. The most striking, most concerning example is pharmaceuticals. India is often called the pharmacy of the world for a reason. It supplies nearly 47% of the U.S. market, especially for essential generic drugs that millions of Americans rely on every single day.
So tariffs on those.
Imposing tariffs on these vital medicines risks creating significant drug shortages in the U.S. and potentially dramatic price hikes for American patients, rebuilding equivalent manufacturing capacity for these complex drugs elsewhere. That would be incredibly costly, take multiple years, if it's even feasible quickly.
And the broader economic impact.
Beyond consumer prices, the tariffs are also forecast to create wider macroeconomic headwinds, contributing to a weaker U.S. dollar, acting as a tangible drag on overall U.S. GDP growth. According to some analyses, like from SBI Research, the economic pain from these tariffs might actually end up being more detrimental to the U.S. economy than to India's more domestically focused economy in the long run.
Okay, and zooming out even further, beyond just India and the U.S., how is this tariff war hitting the broader global economy? Are we seeing wider systemic effects?
Oh, the ripples definitely extend far beyond the bilateral relationship. It's contributing significantly to a more uncertain, more fragmented, and frankly less efficient global economic landscape. When the world's largest economy escalates tariff wars, it creates this chilling effect on international commerce, on investment worldwide.
What do the global bodies say?
The World Trade Organization, the WTO, the guardian of global trade rules, has explicitly warned that these kinds of protectionist trends could lead to a contraction of up to 1% in global merchandise trade volumes. And that disproportionately harms developing nations, the ones who rely heavily on open trade for growth and poverty reduction.
So supply chains everywhere are being scrambled, and maybe not in a good way.
Indeed. These tariffs accelerate the costly, disruptive recalibration of global supply chains. Multinational corporations are forced to rethink where they produce things, often compelled to reroute investment, shift production away from targeted countries towards locations seen as more stable or maybe politically aligned.
But not necessarily more efficient.
Often moving production to less efficient locations, maybe Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe. This leads to systemic inefficiencies, higher production costs globally, and ultimately higher prices for consumers everywhere. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, has repeatedly noted that actions like these fundamentally reinforce a dangerous trend: economic fragmentation along geopolitical lines. It systematically undermines the integrated global economy built up over decades. By weaponizing trade, weaponizing financial flows, the U.S. inadvertently incentivizes the creation of rival economic blocs, alternative payment systems, de-dollarization efforts. It's a profound, maybe irreversible shift in the global economic architecture.
So when we pull way back, look at the really big picture, what does this all mean for America's global standing, its long-term influence? Is this whole America first strategy, especially when used against partners like India, actually self-defeating in the long run?
The evidence, looking at it from multiple angles, strongly suggests that yes, it is. The U.S. tariff strategy seems predicated on a kind of misreading of 21st century economic power. It assumes America's huge market size gives it overwhelming leverage, letting it impose its will with minimal self-harm. But in today's deeply interconnected global economy with these complex, integrated value chains, tariffs are proving to be a really blunt, imprecise, ultimately clumsy instrument. They inevitably boomerang, inflicting significant, often disproportionate costs back on the country imposing them.
We touched on this, but let's just reemphasize that economic self-harm point.
Right.
Because it's critical, and it really challenges the whole premise of these policies, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It bears repeating because it's so central to understanding the true cost. A detailed analysis by SBI Research, a major financial institution, projects with high confidence that the direct economic impact of these tariffs will be more detrimental to the U.S. economy than to India's. Their report forecasts a tangible drag on U.S. GDP, a likely weakening of the dollar against other major currencies, and, most significantly, a substantial surge in inflationary pressures. Tariffs act like a supply-side shock, right? They directly raise the cost of imported goods, intermediate goods, finished goods. These higher costs then get passed on. to American businesses who either absorb them or pass them to consumers. Ultimately, the American public pays.
And the inflation numbers.
The research estimates that an average tariff rate of 20% on all Indian goods could directly add between 1.2% and 2.0% to baseline U.S. inflation. Inflation, which is already projected to stay above the Fed's 2% target through 2026, that's a serious inflationary push.
And translating that to household costs again.
It translates very directly. The tariffs are projected to cost the average U.S. household about $2,400 per year, short term, just from higher prices across a range of goods. And that burden hits lower-income families hardest as they spend a bigger chunk of their income on essential goods. And again, the self-harm is particularly acute, where India is a critical, almost indispensable supplier. Pharmaceuticals, we mentioned, nearly 47% of the U.S. market for crucial generics. Disrupting that vital supply chain for geopolitical leverage rather than direct trade issues risks acute drug shortages, significant price hikes for American patients. It shows a profound disconnect between the trade tactics and the immediate well-being of U.S. citizens and the healthcare system. But this isn't just about the economics, the immediate costs. It's about something deeper, more corrosive. It's about the erosion of trust, the erosion of America's invaluable soft power on the global stage.
That sounds like a profound long-term strategic loss, something potentially very hard to reverse.
It truly is. Beyond the immediate economic fallout, the unilateral, unpredictable, frankly coercive nature of current U.S. trade policy is causing severe, arguably irreparable damage to America's most valuable strategic asset. Its huge, intricate network of global alliances and partnerships. For decades, U.S. global leadership was built on a foundation of predictability, perceived mutual trust, adherence to a rules-based international order. This current approach, transactional, unpredictable, often punitive even towards partners, systematically dismantles that very foundation of trust and reliability.
So Washington is essentially sending a pretty chilling message to every potential ally and partner out there.
Indeed it is. By treating a comprehensive global strategic partner like India as just another trade adversary to be strong-armed, Washington inadvertently sends this chilling message to the rest of the world. Partnership with the U.S. is conditional, it's transactional, it's ultimately unreliable. It signals that even close friends can be targeted, punished for prioritizing their own legitimate national interests, especially if those interests diverge from Washington's immediate demands.
And that encourages hedging.
It encourages other nations, including longstanding allies, to hedge their bets, to diversify their relationships, to pursue greater strategic autonomy away from an increasingly unreliable Washington. You see global opinion polls consistently showing a sharp decline in approval for U.S. leadership. It reflects a world growing wary of American unilateralism and its fallout. This depletion of soft power, the ability to attract and persuade, not just coerce, is a huge long-term strategic loss. It far outweighs any fleeting short-term tactical gains you might get from tariffs.
So putting it all together, rather than preserving U.S. hegemony in the old sense, is this approach actually accelerating the transition to a multipolar world, rather than preventing it? Is it inadvertently bringing about the very future it seems designed to resist?
That's the core of the ultimate irony here, I think. Ultimately, the America First trade policy isn't preserving U.S. hegemony. It is quite actively accelerating its relative decline and the transition to a truly multipolar global landscape. Every unilateral tariff, every broken trade agreement, every coercive act against a partner or a rival, it creates powerful political will and undeniable economic incentive for the rest of the world to build an international order that is less dependent on, less vulnerable to, the whims of the United States.
Which means encouraging parallel systems, alternative structures.
That's precisely what we're seeing. By using its central position in the global economy, its control over the dollar as a weapon, the U.S. is inadvertently generating the political will and economic incentive for other nations to construct parallel systems. It's starkly evident in the outcomes of that July 2025 BRICS summit.
Remind us what happened there.
Significant expansion and admission of Indonesia, 11 new partner countries, a strong, unified condemnation of unilateral coercive measures, a renewed, vigorous push for South-South cooperation, bypassing traditional Western-led institutions.
So BRICS is becoming more assertive.
The expansion and growing influence of platforms like BRICS, the intensifying drive for de-dollarization in global trade, the widespread adoption of strategic autonomy as a guiding principle by rising powers like India, these are all direct, undeniable consequences of recent U.S. policy.
And how do rivals like Russia and China view these U.S. actions as strength?
Quite the opposite, according to our sources. Rival powers like Russia and China tend to view these U.S. actions not as a sign of enduring strength, but actually as a sign of weakness, an inability to adapt, an inability to accept the inevitable erosion of its post-Cold War dominance in this emerging multipolar world. By abandoning the principles multilateralism, predictability, shared prosperity that underpin the very order it created after World War II, the United States isn't just alienating partners, it's providing the primary, most compelling catalyst for the construction of a post-American global landscape. It is, in effect, inadvertently hastening the arrival of the very multipolar competition it claims it wants to win and dominate.
Wow. This deep dive really does reveal a truly pivotal moment in global relations, doesn't it? We've seen how this U.S.-India tariff war is just so much more than a fight over trade numbers or goods crossing borders. It feels like a real collision between maybe a declining hegemon trying to assert its will through economic pressure and a rising power confidently standing firm on its strategic autonomy, even when it hurts.
And what's really fascinating here is how India's principal defense of its national interests, even under serious economic pressure, even with the threat of sanctions hanging over it, is proving to be this potent source of geopolitical strength, of credibility on the world stage. Meanwhile, the U.S. seems to be learning a hard lesson, that the strategies which maybe once secured its primacy are now, in this rapidly shifting global landscape, potentially accelerating its relative decline, incentivizing the very multipolar world it seems to want to avoid.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this as you watch these global dynamics play out? It means recognizing that the world order isn't static, right? It's fluid, it's constantly evolving, and it's profoundly shaped by these moments of friction, of defiance. The outcome of this specific U.S.-India standoff, it won't determine whether the world becomes multipolar. That train has already left the station. That transition is undeniably underway.
Instead, what it's doing is actively shaping the character of that new order. An order where power is more diffuse, where national sovereignty is guarded much more jealously, and where the very architecture of global governance, of economic interaction, is being irrevocably remade right now. This forces us all to think about how nations will build trust, how they'll cooperate in an increasingly fragmented world. Or does this mark the beginning of a sustained and perhaps pretty unsettling era of economic weaponization and strategic isolation?
A profound thought to leave you with indeed, and definitely something to keep a very close eye on as these complex dynamics continue to twist and turn. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.